Hi, I am MMA Grandfather. Today we're counting down the 100 best UFC fighters of all time, from legends who built the sport to the modern warriors dominating the octagon today. Let's get started. From our list, we have Dominic the Devastator Reyes at number 100. He started hot, winning 12 straight fights, beating Chris Weidman and Vince Duprou, then gave John Jones his toughest title fight challenge, but lost controversially. Now he's lost 3 straight fights. At number 99 on our list, we have Clay Guida. Known for his long locks, he has been fighting in the UFC since 2006, and despite never earning a title shot in the UFC, he counts impressive victories over Nate Diaz, Rafael dos Anjos, and Anthony Pettis. He's also one of the most prolific submission artists in the promotion's history. At number 98 on our list, we have Juliana Pena. Amanda Nunes is such a dominant fighter that the only woman to beat and finish her since 2014 simply had to be included on this list. Juliana Pena's rear naked choke of the Lioness in 2021 was one of the biggest upsets of all time, though she did lose the return fixture last year. At number 97 in our list, we have Dan Severn. They simply don't make him like Dan Severn anymore. A pioneer of professional mixed martial arts, Severn was the first person to ever have a UFC title belt wrapped around his waist. He was a fixture in the very early days of the UFC, and he beat Ken Shamrock at UFC 9. At number 96 in our list, we have Alexa Grasso, is an exciting prospect in the women's bantamweight division that could move up a good chunk on this list if she can keep this quality up. She finished Valentina Shevchenko, perhaps the most dominant fighter in UFC history, via face crank, but also dominated in every other aspect of the fight. At number 95 in our list, we have Cub Killer Swanson, one of the most entertaining and exciting fighters to ply his trade in the featherweight division. Cub Swanson has knocked out Charles Oliveira, beaten Dustin Poirier and Jeremy Stevens by decision, and his crazy fight against Doo Ho Choi has been immortalized in the UFC Hall of Fame. At number 94 in our list, we have Carla Esparza. Has had quite an interesting career, as she has taken a winding road from relevancy to irrelevancy, back to relevancy. She won the inaugural women's strawweight belt via rear naked choke against Rose Namajunas, and 2,612 days later. At number 93 in our list, we have Khamzat Chimaev. Few have started their career off as impressively as Khamzat Chimaev. We could do without his antics on social media, but his confidence in the octagon is unmatched, winning his first 3 UFC fights in a span of just 66 days. He now has some more impressive wins over Gilbert Burns and Kevin Holland on his resume. At number 92 in our list, we have Edson Barboza. Win or lose, he is coming into the octagon to put on a show, as evidenced by his record 8 Fight of the Night honors. He's finished Dan Hooker with a body shot, Beneil Dariush with a big knee, and even got a win via leg kicks early on in his career. At number 91 in our list, we have Marlon Vera. Hasn't earned himself a title shot yet, but he's definitely knocking on the door. He's won his last 4 straight bouts, including a nasty front kick finish of Frankie Edgar and a head kick knockout of Dominic Cruz. At number 90 in our list, we have Alex Pereira. He's only had 8 pro mixed martial arts fights in his career, but his background in kickboxing shows you how deadly Alex Pereira can be. The man they call Poatan, meaning hands of stone, has lived up to his name in the UFC, finishing 3 of his 4 opponents in the promotion. At number 89 in our list, we have Holly Holm. You can't have a list like this without including the woman who ended Ronda Rousey's reign of terror in the women's bantamweight division. Arguably the biggest women's upset of all time, Holm's head kick to punches finish of Rousey will live on in UFC lore. At number 88 in our list, we have Joe Lauzon. Though he never strung enough wins together to get a title shot, there was no one more exciting to see duke it out in the octagon than the well-rounded Joe Lauzon in his prime. He beat opponents by submission a whopping 17 times, but he also had 9 knockout finishes as well. At number 87 in our list, we have Petr Yan. For a second there, it seemed like it was going to be Petr Yan's division for the foreseeable future, before he had a moment of madness when he nailed Aljamain Sterling with an illegal knee during their championship bout. At number 86 in our list, we have Chan Sung Jung. When it comes to nicknames, it doesn't get much better than Korean Zombie. a name which he goes by almost exclusively in MMA circles. He's also a trailblazer, putting in the first ever twister submission finish in UFC history against Leonard Garcia. At number 85 in our list, we have Eddie Alvarez, with an 80% finish rate in his wins and a 75% finish rate in his fights overall. Eddie Alvarez is the type of fighter fans come to see. He brought major power into the octagon and used that strength to finish Rafael dos Anjos to take the lightweight belt. At number 84 in our list, we have Corey Sandhagen, one of the most exciting guys to come into the bantamweight division. Corey Sandhagen has finished 10 of his 15 wins and has only been finished himself once. Sandhagen's flying knee finish of legend Frankie Edgar was one of the most jarring finishes you'll ever see. At number 83 in our list, we have Justin Gaethje. The highlight won his first 18 pro fights before joining the UFC and losing his first 2 bouts on the sport's biggest stage. His dominating performance against Tony Ferguson to claim the interim lightweight belt was his shining moment, and his scrap with Michael Chandler in 2021 was as entertaining as it gets. At number 82 in our list, we have Brian Ortega. When it comes to submission threats, Brian Ortega has to be in the conversation. He put Frankie Edgar's lights out, beat up on the Korean Zombie, and nearly submitted Alexander Volkanovski multiple times while getting battered by the champ. At number 81 in our list, we have Colby Covington, one of the most dangerous fighters in the welterweight division right now. Colby Covington fears no man and has been just as impressive in losses to Kamaru Usman as he was in wins over Jorge Masvidal, Tyron Woodley, Rafael dos Anjos, and Robbie Lawler. At number 80, we have Jan Blachowicz, career record 29-9, 1 UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 5 dice performance of the night, 1 ice fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. NA. Jan Blachowicz loves coming into the octagon as an underdog, as he did when he knocked out Dominic Reyes to take the belt and beat up on Israel Adesanya for his first title defense. He's also knocked out Luke Rockhold and beaten Jared Cannonier during his UFC career. At number 79, we have Jiří Denisa Prochazka. Career record 29-3-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 2-point fight of the night, 2-point performance of the night. Notable UFC records achievements, 2022 Fight of the Year. Glover Teixeira, the first UFC champ from the Czech Republic, has had great success in his career, and it culminated in one of the all-time greatest title fights the promotion has seen. It was back and forth for 5 rounds of brutality, with Prochazka eventually outlasting Teixeira and giving the Brazilian a little bit of his own medicine with a rear naked choke tap in the final 30 seconds. At number 78, we have Cody Garbrandt. Career record 13-5. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC bantamweight champion. Performance bonuses, 2 buys performance of the night, 2 buys fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. NA. Cody Garbrandt burst out of the gates to start his MMA career, winning his first 11 straight fights. That streak culminated with an impressive showing to beat Dominic Cruz via unanimous decision and claim the bantamweight belt. His power is nearly unmatched in the bantamweight division, having earned 10 of his 13 wins via TKO KO. At number 77, we have Rafael dos Anjos. Career record 32-14. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC lightweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 4 buys performance of the night, 3 buys fight of the night, 1x submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. Most unanimous decision wins in UFC history, 11. First and only fighter to spend over 8 hours in the octagon, 8-1-49. T5th most wins in UFC history, 21. Rafael dos Anjos is a rare fighter who has found real success in 2 weight classes, winning a championship in the lightweight division and fighting for the interim title in the welterweight division. No one has spent more time in the UFC octagon than dos Anjos, and he's got the best mustache in the sport to boot. Wins over Robbie Lawler, Nate Diaz, and Anthony Pettis ensure that he will always get respect in the world of MMA. At number 76, we have Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Career record 17-6-1. UFC belts, Title defenses, NA. Performance bonuses, 4 ice performance of the night, 3 ice fight of the night, 1 ice knockout of the night. Notable UFC records achievements, NA. Depending on who you ask, many believe Stephen Thompson should have a UFC championship to his name, having drawn against Tyron Woodley in a welterweight championship bout and then lost in a majority decision. Both fights could have gone either way, but neither went Thompson's, which is unfortunate. His unorthodox and unpredictable style has confounded the likes of Robert Whittaker, who he beat via TKO. At number 75, we have Ovince St. Preux, career record, 26-17. UFC belts, title defenses, NA. Performance bonuses, 7 buys performance of the night, 1 bits fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. Most Von Flue choke submissions in UFC history, 4. Most light heavyweight bouts in UFC history, 24. Second most light heavyweight stoppage wins, 11. His only shot at a title came against John Jones, so we know how that went. But Ovince St. Preux has still put together a long and illustrious MMA career, even without the hardware. His unique talent with Von Flue or shoulder chokes makes his career even more intriguing, not to mention 2 statement wins over Shogun Rua, the first of which was a straight KO that was one of the Haitian fighter's best moments in the octagon. At number 74, we have Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone, career record, 36-17. 2. UFC belts, title defenses, NA. Performance bonuses, 7 ice performance of the night, 6 fight of the night, 3 ice knockout of the night, 2 ice submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. Second most wins in UFC history, 23. Second most finishes in UFC history, 16. Most post-fight bonuses, 18. Most knockdowns in UFC history, 20. Donald Cerrone has not had much luck recently, failing to get a win in his last 7 fights, 5 of which were finishes for his opponent. But you're bound to have some cold streaks when you fight as long as Cowboy has. His 18 post-fight bonuses speak to how entertaining a fighter he is, and why the UFC keeps giving him contracts despite the fact that he's never won a belt. His resume includes impressive wins over Jim Miller, Eddie Alvarez, and Benson Henderson. At number 73, we have Tim the Maniac Sylvia. Career record, 31-10. UFC belts, title defenses, 2x UFC heavyweight champion, 3. Performance bonuses, 1x fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, NA. Big guys need love too, and Tim Sylvia was certainly a massive man. Weighing in at 265, he was always pushing the division's limits, and he did the same to his opponents. He finished a whopping 22 of his 31 wins by TKO KO, including in both of his UFC title-winning fights. It's also worth noting that his 2 stints at the top of the heavyweight division came 3 years apart, showing an impressive determination to get his belt back. At number 72, we have Dustin "Diamond" Poirier. Career record, 29-7-1. UFC belts, title defenses, interim UFC lightweight champion. Performance bonuses, 8 by fight of the night, 4 by performance of the night, 1 by submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. Most fight of the night bonuses, 8. Most lightweight knockouts, 8. 5th most wins in UFC history, 21. Poirier has beaten anybody who's anybody in the lightweight division, except for the 2 submission artists that have been atop the division for the last few years in Khabib Nurmagomedov and Charles Oliveira. Poirier has taken down Max Holloway, Conor McGregor twice, and somewhat embarrassingly for McGregor, Michael Chandler, Justin Gaethje, and Eddie Alvarez. At number 71, we have Jim A-10 Miller. Career record, 35-17. UFC belts, title defenses, NA. Performance bonuses, 7 by fight of the night, 3 BICS performance of the night, 3 BICS submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. Most wins in UFC history, 24. Most bouts in UFC history, 41. Second most finishes in UFC history, 16. Second most submissions in UFC history, 2012 Fight of the Year, Joe Lauzon. Jim Miller first entered the UFC octagon way back in 2008, and he continues to ply his trade, most recently fighting in February 2023. He's the benchmark for mixed martial arts longevity, and despite never fighting for a UFC belt, he actually has some solid wins on his resume, including a knee bar finish of a young Charles Oliveira, a classic decision win over Joe Lauzon, and a guillotine choke win over Donald Cerrone just last year. At number 70, we have Leon "Rocky" Edwards. Career record 23-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC welterweight champion. Performance bonuses, 2 buys performance of the night. Notable UFC records: achievements, 6th fastest finish in UFC history, 8 seconds. The first Jamaican-born UFC champion. There aren't many that have earned their belt in more shocking fashion than Leon Edwards' 5th-round head kick finish of Kamaru Usman last year. He's also beaten the likes of Nate Diaz, despite a late scare, Cowboy Cerrone, and Rafael dos Anjos. At number 69, we have Andrei the Pitbull Arlovski. Career record 34-21. 2 UFC belts, title defenses, UFC heavyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 2 buys fight of the night, 1 out performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements: second most wins in UFC history, 23, 23, 23-6 fights in UFC history, 39. Most heavyweight total fight time, 6-1-11, 41. Significant strikes landed, 1,336. But when it comes to longevity, there's no one that can stand up next to Andrei Arlovski, other than Jim Miller and Donald Cerrone. The guy just keeps going and going. He's like a massive Belarusian Energizer bunny. His Achilles lock win over Tim Sylvia put him in the pantheon of heavyweight champs, and his staying power has been insane to witness. The guy fought 3 times in 2022 at age 43 and won 2 of those bouts. At number 68, we have Anthony "Showtime" Pettis. Career record 25-14. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC lightweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 3 buys performance of the night, 2 buys knockout of the night, 2 buys fight of the night, 1x submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, NA. You name it, and Anthony Pettis could finish an opponent with it. He's polished guys off with head kicks, triangle chokes, guillotine chokes, arm bars, kicks to the body, and good old-fashioned TKOs via punches. Pettis used his excellently varied skill set to take over the lightweight division for a time, earning 2 straight Knockout of the Night awards in the lead-up to his championship-winning armbar against Benson Henderson. At number 67, we have Islam Makhachev. Career record 24-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC lightweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 2 buy fight of the night, 1 buy performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, second longest lightweight winning streak. Islam Makhachev's odyssey to the top of the lightweight division has been a sight to see, taking the mantle from fellow countryman and cornerman Khabib Nurmagomedov. The fact that he submitted Charles Oliveira with what seemed a lot like ease means he should be taken seriously. His win over Alexander Volkanovski wasn't exactly impressive, but the guy hasn't lost since 2015, so he needs to be respected nonetheless. At number 66, we have Brock Lesnar. Career record 5-3-1. UFC belts, title defenses. UFC heavyweight champion 2. Performance bonuses, 1 buys submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, NA. Already well known as a big-name pro wrestler, Brock Lesnar took a chance and made the switch to the octagon, which paid off in spades. He put Randy Couture on the mat to claim the belt, defended it via TKO over Frank Mir, and even locked in a submission win over Shane Carwin. There's no one that's had a career in combat sports quite like Lesnar. At number 65, we have Matt the Terror Serra. Career record 11-7. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC welterweight champion. Performance bonuses, 2 buys knockout of the year, 1 fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, UFC Hall of Fame 2018, first fighter to win both a UFC belt and an Ultimate Fighter tournament. Joining the UFC in 2001, Matt Serra really got in on the ground floor here, which is why he's been honored as a Hall of Famer. However, he could have been on this list due to one single fight, his TKO finish of Georgie St. Pierre, to claim the belt in 2007. It is widely viewed as the biggest upset win ever in the UFC, and as the only person to ever finish GSP via TKO, he's got credentials in the octagon that no one else does. At number 64, we have Thug. Rose Namajunas. Career record 11-5. UFC belts, title defenses, 2 buys women's strawweight champion 2. Performance bonuses, 3 buys performance of the night, 3 buys fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, T-most strawweight finishes 5. First women to regain a title she previously lost. With one of the best nicknames in the game and a mean scowl to go with it, Thug Rose strikes fear in the hearts of her opponents. And those opponents are usually pretty darn good, as Namajunas can count wins over 3 former strawweight champs, with a decision win over Jessica Andrade in an excellent tussle, a TKO finish of Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and a gnarly headkick KO of Zhang Weili. At number 63 we have Vitor, the Phenom, Belfort. Career record, 26-14, 1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 5 Bice knockout of the night, 1 Bex performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, second most knockouts in UFC history, 12, most first-round finishes in UFC history. Vitor Belfort was a UFC fixture for more than 20 years, starting with the promotion in its infancy and watching as it grew into the phenomenon it is today. No one has finished more opponents in the opening round than Belfort, who was absolutely dominant when he was at his best. He beat Randy Couture to claim the belt, and also fought for the middleweight championship as well. At number 62 we have Davison Deus de Guerra. Figueiredo, career record 21-1. UFC belts, title defenses, 2x UFC flyweight champion 2. Performance bonuses, 3x fight of the night, 1x performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, T-most flyweight finishes 7, fastest flyweight submission 157, 2020 fighter of the year, 4 straight finishes leading up to his legendary quadrilogy with Brandon Moreno cemented Figueiredo's status as a legend of this young division. He guillotine choked Alex Perez and Tim Elliott for finishes in a combined 5:05, and his back-to-back finishes of Joseph Benavidez really made people take notice. Though he came out on the wrong end of the Moreno series, there's no arguing his power and perseverance.
At number 61, we have Brandon the Assassin Baby Moreno. Career record 21-2. UFC belts, title defenses, 2x UFC flyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 3x fight of the night, 3x performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. First Mexican UFC champion. The pride of Tijuana has cemented himself as an all-timer, thanks to his quadrilogy against Davison Figueiredo. Squabbles where Moreno came out on top more often than not, even rear-naked choking Figgy to claim the belt in the second fight. His TKO finish of Kai Kara France via body kick in between those classics exhibited just how well-rounded the Assassin Baby really is. And talk about a concrete chin. Goodness me.
At number 60 we have Lyoto the Dragon Machida. Career record 26-12. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 4 buys knockout of the night, 3 buys fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. 2011 knockout of the year, Randy Couture. Lyoto Machida is perhaps most well known for his battles with Shogun Rua, but he had a lot more signature moments than that. His front kick finish of Randy Couture in 2011 was a masterpiece, and his straight KO of Rashad Evans to claim the belt was not too shabby either. Losing 7 of his last 11 fights takes a little luster away from his overall record, but not from his legacy. At number 59, we have Fabricio Cavallo Verdum. Career record 24-9-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC heavyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 3 by performance of the night, 1 eye fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. NA. Fabricio Verdum had the power of any solid heavyweight, but what set him apart was his ability to submit opponents in the highest weight division, which is a bit of a rarity. He submitted 12 opponents over his illustrious career, including a guillotine choke to put Cain Velasquez down and claim the heavyweight belt in 2015. At number 58, we have Cain Velasquez. Career record 14-3. UFC belts, title defenses, 2x UFC heavyweight champion 2. Performance bonuses, 3 decks knockout of the night, 1x performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. T second most heavyweight knockouts, 10. Most heavyweight takedowns, 34. Most total heavyweight strikes landed, 1,464. Though his career in the octagon ended in a 26-second knockout by Francis Ngannou, Cain Velasquez is one of the most successful UFC heavyweights to ever do it. He finished the enormous Brock Lesnar, beat Junior Dos Santos twice after Dos Santos had taken his belt previously, and also knocked Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira out. Not only was he throwing with wicked intentions, he has the highest heavyweight significant strike percentage at over 57, meaning he was as accurate as they come when throwing bombs. At number 57, we have Mauricio Shogun Rua. Career record, 27-14-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 4x fight of the night, 3x knockout of the night, 1x performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. UFC Hall of Fame 2018, 2011 Fight of the Year, Dan Henderson. T-most light heavyweight bonuses, 8, when you TKO legends like Mark Coleman and Chuck Liddell in back-to-back bouts. You're a pretty darn good fighter, and that's exactly what Hall of Famer Shogun Rua is. He had 2 straight classic matchups with Lyoto Machida, losing the first and winning the second to claim the belt. Unfortunately, he ran into the John Jones buzzsaw right after that. But after his loss to Jones, he did knock Forrest Griffin out cold and combine with Dan Henderson to put on the Fight of the Year later in 2011. At number 56, we have Luke Rockhold. Career record 16-6. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC middleweight champion. Performance bonuses, 2x fight of the night, 2x performance of the night, 1x knockout of the night. Notable UFC records, achievements, NA, 5 straight finishes in 2014 and 2015, all achieved in different ways, displayed Luke Rockhold's well-rounded fighting style and culminated in having the middleweight belt draped around his waist. The run included submissions of Michael Bisping and Lyoto Machida, as well as a TKO finish of Chris Weidman. In his final bout, he put on a show in one of the most entertaining fights in recent memory, a decision loss to Paulo Costa during which both men were stumbled, and Rockhold hilariously attempted to use his own blood to slow Costa down. He was quite the character. At number 55, we have Jessica Bate-Istaka. Andrade career record, 24-10, UFC belts, title defenses, UFC women's strawweight champion. Performance bonuses, 5x performance of the night, 4x fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. T-most UFC women's wins, 15. Most post-fight bonuses in UFC women's history, 9. Most bouts in UFC women's history, 23. A UFC women's legend, no woman has entered the octagon more times than Jessica Andrade, whose well-rounded game has seen her knock out 9 opponents, submit 8 and win via decision against another 7. Her KO slam of Rose Namajunas to take the belt was one of the most unique ways the UFC has ever seen a new champion crowned. She also put in the first standing triangle choke finish in UFC history. At number 54, we have Robert "The Reaper" Whittaker. Career record, 24-6. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC middleweight champion. Performance bonuses, 5x fight of the night, 3x performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. First Australian UFC champion. Robert Whittaker is still very much in the mix in the middleweight division, sitting at number 2 on the division's rankings and 14th in the pound-for-pound charts. After a tough start to his UFC career, Bobby Knuckles found his groove and won 9 straight to claim the middleweight belt. That streak included wins over Derek Brunson and twice over Yoel Romero in some classic battles. Recent decisions over Marvin Vettori, Darren Till and Jared Cannonier prove he's still a force to be reckoned with. At number 53, we have Robbie "Ruthless" Lawler. Career record, 29-16-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC welterweight champion 2. Performance bonuses, 5x fight of the night, 1 whole knockout of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, 2014 and 2015 Fighter of the Year, 2014 Fight of the Year, Rory MacDonald. For a while there, Robbie Lawler was appointment viewing in the UFC, winning back-to-back Fighter of the Year awards, while also earning Fight of the Year honors in both years for his slugfests with Johnny Hendricks and Rory MacDonald. He had a rough go of it after he lost his belt to Tyron Woodley, but he flashed that warrior mentality again in a win over Nick Diaz in 2021. At number 52, we have Frank Mir. Career record, 19-13. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC heavyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 2x submission of the night, 2x performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. T-most heavyweight finishes, 13. Third most heavyweight wins, 16. Second most heavyweight fights, 27. 2011 submission of the year, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. You might not know Frank Mir, but you should. He submitted a mountain of a man in Brock Lesnar. He's the only fighter to win via toe-hold submission in UFC history. He completed the fastest submission in UFC heavyweight history, 45 seconds, and he fought 5 heavyweight champs, beating 3 of them, including Tim Sylvia and Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira.
At number 51, we have Glover Teixeira, career record 33-9, UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion, performance bonuses, 4x performance of the night, 4x fight of the night, 1x knockout of the night, 1x submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements: most light heavyweight finishes, 13, most light heavyweight submissions, 7, second most light heavyweight wins, 16, 2022 Fight of the Year, Jiri Prochazka. At 43 years of age, Glover Teixeira just recently retired from the UFC on the back of 3 straight title fights. Teixeira shocked the world when he submitted Jan Blachowicz to win his first UFC belt as a massive underdog. He was the second oldest UFC champ in history, but that didn't stop him from putting on one of the greatest shows in the promotion's history in an exhilarating back-and-forth romp in his very next fight against Jiri Prochazka, which he lost in the final 30 seconds. A negative word has never been whispered about this man, and he will certainly end up in the Hall of Fame.
At number 50, we have Zhang Magnum Weili, career record 23-3, UFC belts, title defenses, 2x, UFC Women's Strawweight Champion 1, performance bonuses, 3x performance of the night, 1x fight of the night, notable UFC records/achievements, first Chinese UFC champion, 2020 Fight of the Year, Joanna Jędrzejczyk, one of the best in the women's game right now. Zhang Weili is like a bloodhound in the octagon when she smells blood, finishing 19 of her 23 wins. Her 2 losses to Rose Namajunas mar her otherwise sparkling record a tad, but they're basically washed out by her performances against the greatest strawweight we have ever seen in Joanna Jędrzejczyk. After arguably the greatest and most brutal battle in UFC history in their first bout, Zhang made no mistake in the return fixture, putting the Polish pugilist down with one of the most beautifully nasty spinning backfist finishes you'll ever see. At number 49, we have Nate Diaz, career record 21-13, UFC belts, title defenses, NA, performance bonuses, 8x fight of the night, 5x submission of the night, 2x performance of the night, 1x knockout of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements: T most fight of the night bonuses, 8, T second most lightweight submissions, 7, third most post-fight bonuses, 16. If you want to know what mixed martial arts is about, look no further than Nate Diaz. The guy is the absolute epitome of the toughness that MMA requires. He may have never won a belt, but he has entertained the masses to the highest extent and continues to do so with an underrated skill set. He's hilarious outside of the octagon and is unpredictable inside it. His submission of Conor McGregor will live forever in infamy, and at 37 years old, Stockton, California's finest, is still major danger to anyone who takes the chance of a fight with him. At number 48, we have Junior Cigano dos Santos. Career record 21-10. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC heavyweight champion, performance bonuses, 3x knockout of the night, 3x fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements: longest heavyweight winning streak 9, T second most heavyweight knockouts 10. Boasting some absolute cinder blocks for fists, Junior dos Santos had a predatory instinct in the octagon, knocking his opponent out in 15 of his 21 wins. Dos Santos has conquered the likes of Stipe Miocic, Frank Mir, Cain Velasquez, Tai Tuivasa, and Derek Lewis, all of which came by TKO or KO apart from Miocic. Cigano has not seen the final bell in 7 straight fights, though one has to wonder if he has overstayed his welcome at this point, having been TKO'd in his last 5 straight outings. At number 47, we have Jens Lil Evil Pulver. Career record 27-19-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC lightweight champion 2. Performance bonuses, NA. Notable UFC records, achievements: first lightweight to defend his title in UFC history. First lightweight to headline a UFC event, UFC 35 versus BJ Penn. Lil Evil indeed. Jens Pulver is aptly named because he used to absolutely pulverize his opposition at his apex. He made the MMA community take the lightweight division seriously and went undefeated in his first 7 UFC bouts. His reign atop the division might have lasted even longer if he hadn't been forced to vacate the title due to a contract dispute. At number 46, we have Mark the Hammer Coleman. Career record 16-10. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC heavyweight champion, performance bonuses, one ice fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, UFC Hall of Fame 2008, UFC 10 and UFC 11 tournament winner. By the end of his trailblazing career, Mark Coleman's numbers didn't look gaudy, but he gets respect here for helping to make mixed martial arts a sport to be taken seriously. He was the promotion's first ever heavyweight champion, and also won the UFC 10 tournament, during which he fought thrice in one day, and the UFC 11 tournament just 2 months later, during which he fought twice in one day. All 5 of those tournament wins came by finish, by the way. Coleman was the definition of tough as nails. At number 45, we have Forrest Griffin. Career record, 19-7. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion. Performance bonuses, 5 by fight of the night, 1 submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, UFC Hall of Fame as fighter, UFC Hall of Fame fight wing, Stephen Bonner in Ultimate Fighter 1 finale. A Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, Forrest Griffin was a force to be reckoned with in the octagon, taking 2 decisions over Tito Ortiz, submitting Shogun Rua, and winning a unanimous decision over Rampage Jackson. His UD victory over Stephen Bonner to cap the first light heavyweight Ultimate Fighter tournament, back in 2005, is rightly immortalized in the promotion's Hall of Fame. At number 44, we have Rashad Suga Evans, career record 28-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion, performance bonuses, 2 by fight of the night, 2 by performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, UFC Hall of Fame 2019, knockout of the year, Chuck Liddell. The man who took Griffin's title made his presence known in the UFC in the most unmissable fashion by beating fellow Hall of Famer Michael Bisping via decision before knocking out Chuck Liddell cold in one of the most shocking upsets in the sport's history. That knockout of the year, winning performance set him up for a title shot, which he snatched with both hands. After losing his belt, he beat Rampage Jackson in a great battle and came back and finished Ortiz in his next bout. At number 43, we have Michael the Count Bisping. Career record 39. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC middleweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 5 by fight of the night, 2 ice performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, UFC Hall of Fame 2019, retired with most UFC fights 29, most middleweight wins 16, most middleweight significant strikes landed 1,184. Fans who just started following the UFC in the last few years will recognize his voice as one of the top UFC commentators outside the octagon nowadays, but in his day, Michael Bisping was a force inside the octagon. He beat Anderson Silva in a real brawl and followed that up by knocking out champion Luke Rockhold in the first round to claim the title. He had Georges St-Pierre bleeding all over the place in their marquee title fight, before arguably the best to ever do it finished Bisping in the 3rd round. At number 42, we have Chris Cyborg, career record 26-1, UFC belts, title defenses, UFC Women's Featherweight Champion 2, performance bonuses, 1 eye fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, most wins in women's featherweight history 4. One of the early pioneers of women's MMA, Cyborg not only dominated the UFC, but she held world championships in 4 different mixed martial arts promotions at the same time, making her the only Grand Slam champion, male or female, in the sport's history. She was an absolute knockout artist in the women's featherweight division, the likes of which we've never seen before or since, recording 20 wins by knockout during her career. Apart from her very first fight, the only loss she ever suffered was to the greatest female fighter of all time, Amanda Nunes. At number 41, we have Aljamain Funkmaster Sterling. Career record 22-3. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC Bantamweight Champion 2. Performance bonuses, 1 by performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. T most bantamweight wins 13, T longest bantamweight winning streak 8. While he did grab his belt under strange circumstances after Petr Yan was DQ'd for an illegal knee in their title fight, Sterling proved his mettle in the rematch, winning a split decision that wasn't as close as the scorecards would suggest. He's beaten division legend Renan Barao by decision. He rear-naked choked Corey Sandhagen into oblivion, and he folded TJ Dillashaw in his most recent fight at UFC 280. At number 40, we have Pat The Croatian sensation, Militic. Career record, 29-7-2. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC welterweight champion, 4 performance bonuses, NA. Notable UFC records, achievements, UFC Hall of Fame, UFC 16 welterweight tournament winner. A pioneer of the sport, Militic held sway over the welterweight division from his win in the inaugural welterweight title fight in 1998 until 2001. He may be called the Croatian sensation, but his ability to lock in submissions was definitely reminiscent of a Brazilian jiu-jitsu master, submitting a whopping 16 opponents over his illustrious Hall of Fame career.
At number 39, we have TJ Dillashaw. Career record 17-5. UFC belts, title defenses, 2x UFC bantamweight champion 3. Performance bonuses, 5x performance of the night, 3x fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. Most bantamweight knockouts 7, most bantamweight wins 13, most bantamweight title fight wins 5. When you're talking about bantamweight at 135 pounds, you're not usually talking about a ton of knockout power, but that's exactly what Dillashaw always brought to the table. He won 3 straight title fights by finish before a questionable split decision loss to Dominic Cruz, but Dillashaw was unfazed and won the belt back by knocking Cody Garbrandt out 2 times in a row before a failed drug test after knocking out Henry Cejudo stripped him of his belt. He's also the only fighter to finish 2 title fights in the 5th and final round.
At number 38, we have Benson "Smooth" Henderson. Career record 30-12. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC lightweight champion 3. Performance bonuses, 3 buys fight of the night, 1s performance of the night. Notable UFC records, achievements, unified UFC and Strikeforce lightweight championships, most lightweight title defenses 3. No one, not Penn, not Edgar, not Nurmagomedov had a longer reign atop the lightweight division, beating Edgar twice and Nate Diaz once, in the span of 1 calendar year in 2012, is about as impressive as it gets. At number 37, we have Tony "El Cookie" Ferguson. Career record 25-8, UFC belts, title defenses, interim UFC lightweight champion. Performance bonuses, 6 by fight of the night, 3 by performance of the night, 1x knockout of the night, 1x submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, 1 Ultimate Fighter 13, longest lightweight winning streak, 12. He was arguably the biggest star in the sport during his unprecedented 12-fight winning streak, where he tormented opponents with his unorthodox and deadly style and entertained viewers to no end with his antics both in and outside the octagon. Unfortunately, he was robbed of a real title shot after no less than 5 scheduled bouts against Khabib Nurmagomedov fell through. At number 36, we have Tyron "The Chosen One" Woodley. Career record 19-7-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC welterweight champion 4. Performance bonuses, 3 ice performance of the night, 2 ice fight of the night, 1 ice knockout of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements, NA. The aura around Tyron Woodley died a bit after his 2 losses in the boxing ring to up-jumped boxer Jake Paul, but there's no denying his dominance in the UFC octagon. A wrestler by trade, Woodley was about as dominant as it got when he was at his apex, putting Robbie Lawler out to take his belt and submitting Darren Till during his reign. His 2 absolute battles with Stephen Thompson, which resulted in a draw and a majority decision for Woodley, were elite entertainment. At number 35, we have Francis "The Predator" Ngannou. Career record 17-3. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC heavyweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 6 by performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. World record for hardest punch. You might think that the fact that Francis Ngannou registered the hardest punch ever on a visit to the UFC Performance Institute in 2017 says all you need to know about the first Cameroon-born UFC champ, but you'd be wrong. Yes, his 12 knockouts are impressive, especially that voracious 20-second finish of Jairzinho Rozenstruik, but his performances against strong all-around fighters, Stipe Miocic and Cyril Gane, prove that the Predator is a true mixed martial artist and a true UFC legend. We await his return. At number 34, we have Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Career record 16-5. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC Women's Strawweight Champion 5. Performance bonuses, 3 ice fight of the night, 1 vice performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. T most title fights in UFC women's history. T most wins in women's strawweight. 2020 Fight of the Year, Zhang Weili. While it may be tough to decipher how to pronounce her last name, it's not hard to figure out why she's on this list. Jędrzejczyk is a bona fide legend and arguably the greatest women's strawweight performer the UFC has ever seen. From her UFC debut in 2014 to 2017, she was unbeatable and untouchable in her division, and her split decision loss to Zhang Weili in 2020 might be the best bout the UFC has ever seen. At number 33, we have Frankie the Answer, Edgar.
Career record 24-11-1.
UFC belts, title defenses, UFC lightweight champion 3. Performance bonuses, 8 by fight of the night, 2 ice performance of the night, 1 Ike out of the night. Notable UFC records, attachments, T most fight of the night bonuses 8. Second most total fight time in UFC history, 7:57:10. But even outside of his sheer willpower and longevity, Edgar has a very impressive UFC resume. He beat BJ Penn in back-to-back fights, took down Charles Oliveira by decision, and for about a decade, he was not a guy anyone wanted to see across the octagon, starting his career with a 22-5-1 record. At number 32, we have Ronda Rousey. Career record 12-2. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC Women's Bantamweight Champion 6. Performance bonuses, 4 by performance of the night, 2 by fight of the night, 1 X submission of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. First female UFC Hall of Famer, first UFC Women's Champion, won first women's UFC fight ever, longest title fight finish streak in UFC history, 6. Whatever you think of her post-UFC career outside of the octagon, you can't debate Rousey's credentials. Apart from Nunes and Shevchenko, she is without a doubt the most dominant woman to fight in the UFC, winning her first 12 straight bouts in an average of 128 seconds per fight, including 8 in the first minute. She put women's MMA on the map, and her prime was unlike any other. You really just had to be there. At number 31, we have Chris Weidman. Career record 15-6, UFC belts, title defenses, UFC middleweight champion 3, performance bonuses, 3 by fight of the night, 2 by's knockout of the night, 1 sub submission of the night, 1 sub performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. NA, there's no need to explain this one. The guy who ended Anderson Silva's legendary time at the top of the middleweight division gets a spot on here just on that one fight. But not only did Weidman knock out arguably the GOAT to take his belt, he also defended in the rematch, and defended it twice more after that. Losing 6 of his last 8 fights moved him down the list, but that 13-fight winning streak to start his career was something else. At number 30, we have Israel the Last Stylebender, Adesanya. Career record 23-2. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC middleweight champion 5. Performance bonuses, 5 by performance of the night, 2 ice fight of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. Most knockdowns in a UFC title fight, 4. Second longest middleweight winning streak, 12. For 2.5 years from 2018 to late 2020, there was perhaps no fighter more exciting to watch than the unconventional stylebender. He started off his career with 20 straight wins and burst onto the UFC scene in 2018 with a performance of the night bonus against Rob Wilkinson. Wars with Anderson Silva and Kevin Gastelum, and big-time finishes of Paulo Costa and Robert Whittaker in title fights make him a must-have on the list of the all-time greats. At number 29, we have Quinton Rampage Jackson. Career record 38-14. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion 1. Performance bonuses, 3 by fight of the night, 2 ice knockout of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements. United UFC and Pride light heavyweight belts. The man they call Rampage is not only one of the greatest for what he did in the octagon, but also for how important he was in growing the popularity of the sport of MMA, early on with his aggressive highlight reel fighting style and eccentric personality. Jackson burst onto the UFC scene in 2007 when he knocked Chuck Liddell out cold in the first round to claim the title, and also has wins over Wanderlei Silva and Lyoto Machida on his resume. At number 28, we have Charles "Do Bronx" Oliveira. Career record 33-9-1. UFC belts, Title defenses: UFC lightweight champion, 1 performance bonuses, 12 by performance of the night, 3 by fight of the night, 3 by submission of the night. Notable UFC records achievements: submission of the year 2014, most finishes in UFC history 19, most submission wins in UFC history 16, most performance bonuses 18, most submissions in lightweight and featherweight 10 and 6. One of the most exciting fighters to watch in the octagon, thanks in large part to his unparalleled jiu-jitsu and submission abilities, which are arguably the greatest the sport has ever seen. There is no UFC fighter that has earned more performance bonuses than DuBronx. Oliveira finally got the belt he coveted after beating Kevin Lee, Tony Ferguson, and Michael Chandler. He then dominated Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje as the champ before ceding the belt. At number 27, we have Tito, the Huntington Beach bad boy. Ortiz career record 21-12-1. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC light heavyweight champion, 5 title defenses, performance bonuses, 4 by fight of the night, 1 submission of the night, 1 knockout of the night, 1 fight of the year. Forrest Griffin, notable UFC record/achievements, UFC Hall of Fame, 2012, second most championship fights at light heavyweight 9, second most successful light heavyweight title defenses 5. As a member of the UFC Hall of Fame's pioneer wing, Tito Ortiz's MMA credentials are definitely solidified. He was the man to beat in the light heavyweight division for over 1,200 days and counted Wanderlei Silva and Ken Shamrock among the fighters he vanquished in title fights. He beat Shamrock 3 times, knocked out Chuck Liddell, and his split decision win over Forrest Griffin 2006 has become the stuff of UFC legend. At number 26, we have Alexander, the Great Volkanovski. Career record 25-2. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC featherweight champion, 4 title defenses, performance bonuses, 3 by fight of the night, 1 by performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements: second longest featherweight winning streak, 10 most title fight wins in featherweight history. Volkanovski has finished 15 opponents in the octagon and counts impressive wins over Brian Ortega and Jung Chan Sung in title defenses. His trio of wins over arguably the greatest featherweight of all time, Max Holloway, cement him as one of the greatest. At number 25, we have Dan Henderson. Hendo, career record 32-15. UFC belts, title defenses, UFC 17 middleweight tournament championship, performance bonuses, 4 buys fight of the night, 1 buys knockout of the night, 2 eyes performance of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements: 2011 fight of the year with Mauricio Rua, oldest fighter to compete for a UFC championship, 46 YO. Daniel Henderson is best known for his all-time battle with Mauricio Rua in 2011, a fight that was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame's fight wing in 2018. However, Henderson had many other impressive wins, including victories over Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Vitor Belfort, and Michael Bisping. While he never held a traditional UFC belt, he did fight in 3 championship bouts. At number 24, we have Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Minotauro, career record 34-10-1. UFC belts, title defenses, 1x, UFC interim heavyweight championship. Performance bonuses 2x, fight of the night, 1x, knockout of the night. Notable UFC records/achievements: UFC Hall of Fame, 2016. The man they call the Minotaur, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, was one of the earliest stars of the UFC. Though his base was in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Nogueira was also a great boxer and takedown artist. He is also one of the few proponents of fighting from the bottom, employing an offensive open guard with great skill. His prowess on the ground, highlighted by his many armbar and triangle choke finishes, was way ahead of his time as well. At number 23, we have Ken Shamrock. Career record 28-17-2. UFC belts, title defenses, 1 Weiss UFC Superfight Championship 2. Performance bonuses, NA. Notable UFC records/achievements: longest fight in UFC history, 36 minutes. One of the pioneers of the sport, Ken Shamrock, has been around since the beginning of the UFC, competing in 8 of the UFC's first 9 events. He won the inaugural UFC Superfight belt, which is all the more impressive considering it was an open-weight competition, meaning there were no weight classes. His 36-minute draw with Royce Gracie at UFC 5 remains one of the greatest fights in MMA history. At number 22, we have Rich Franklin Ace. Career record 29-7, 1. UFC belts. Title defenses: 1 UFC Middleweight Championship. 2. Performance bonuses: 1 UFC Knockout of the Night, 2 UFC Fight of the Night. Notable UFC records/achievements: UFC Hall of Fame 2019, most significant strikes in UFC Middleweight Championship bout, 127. Known for his concrete hands and knockout power, Rich Franklin was part of the UFC's early success under new president Dana White in the early 2000s. Franklin was able to finish Ken Shamrock and knock Chuck Liddell out cold, so his credentials as one of the best UFC fighters are quite valid.
At number 21, we have Frank Shamrock. Career record 23-10-2. UFC belts. Title defenses: 1 Doik. UFC Light Heavyweight Championship 4. Performance bonuses: NA. Notable UFC records/achievements: headlined first UFC event in Brazil. Fastest submission in UFC light heavyweight history. The adopted younger brother of Ken Shamrock, Frank was one of the first fighters to really embrace the mixed part of mixed martial arts. He combined a strong wrestling, ground-focused background with what became a deadly orthodox kickboxing game, also studying Jeet Kune Do before his UFC debut.
At number 20 in our list, we have Dominick Cruz, one of the most highly regarded mixed martial artists at the bantamweight level. Dominick Cruz was the UFC's first champion in that division. Cruz is known for his strong wrestling and quick striking ability, but most of all for the unorthodox angles at which he attacks his opponents. At number 19 in our list, we have BJ Penn. The only fighter to win both the lightweight and welterweight titles, BJ Penn's record might seem mediocre, but that's only because of a fall-off during the latter half of his career. Considered one of the greatest boxers in UFC history by legendary trainer Freddie Roach, Penn knocked out Matt Hughes and put up some tough performances in losing efforts against Georges St-Pierre. At number 18 in our list, we have Henry Cejudo. While he finished 8 of his 16 wins via TKO, Henry Cejudo is also known for his prowess in freestyle wrestling, a discipline in which he won an Olympic gold medal, becoming the only athlete ever to win both a UFC belt and Olympic gold. Cejudo finished his career on a 6-fight winning streak during which he claimed 2 UFC belts and defended each of them once. At number 17 in our list, we have Matt Hughes. During his reign as the UFC welterweight champ, Matt Hughes was considered by many to be the one pound-for-pound MMA fighter in the world. Hughes, whose MMA style stems from a wrestling background, has 2 separate 6-fight winning streaks in the UFC to his name. At number 16 in our list, we have Conor McGregor. Is one of the greatest UFC fighters we've seen, but his prowess inside the ring has somewhat been overshadowed by his polarizing figure outside of the octagon. Nonetheless, the power he possessed for his weight class was immense, and his 13-second knockout of Jose Aldo to claim the featherweight title was a sight to behold. At number 15 in our list, we have Valentina Shevchenko, one of the most dominant mixed martial artists we've ever seen. Valentina Shevchenko has not lost to anyone not named Amanda Nunes since 2010. She has barely been challenged during her reign at the top of the women's flyweight division and has beaten 4 former UFC champions. At number 14 in our list, we have Max Holloway, one of the best boxing technicians the Octagon has ever seen. Max Holloway has mastered the sweet science like few others in the sport of MMA. He knocked Jose Aldo out twice during his reign atop the UFC featherweight division, and also bested Frankie Edgar. At number 13 in our list, we have Kamaru Usman, remains the greatest welterweight we've ever seen this side of Georges St-Pierre. He was criticized early in his career for a boring brand of fighting that involved extended clinches and playing for points, but recent knockouts of Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal, and Gilbert Burns show that he can bring the fireworks when it's super necessary. At number 12 in our list, we have Randy Couture. One could say that Randy Couture was the first UFC superstar with a mid-career streak of 14 out of 15 fights with a belt on the line. He is the only fighter to reclaim a belt he had previously lost 3 separate times, and his late career success into his 40s remains unparalleled. At number 11 in our list, we have Daniel Cormier. As just the second simultaneous 2-division champ in UFC history, Daniel Cormier is in very elite company. He has also created an impressive life for himself just outside the octagon, as one of the premier UFC commentators today. At number 10 in our list, we have Chuck Liddell, credited for popularizing UFC and bringing into the mainstream along with his rival Randy Couture. Chuck Liddell was the author of some of the most brutal knockouts the Octagon has seen, knocking his opponents out cold on 9 different occasions. At number 9 in our list, we have Royce Gracie, the very first UFC superstar and a true MMA pioneer. Royce Gracie won 3 of the first 4 UFC events when there were no weight classes and nearly no rules. At UFC 1, he fought thrice in one night. At UFC 2, he fought a record 4 times in one night. And at UFC 4, he fought 3 more times in one night. At number 8 in our list, we have Jose Aldo was the first UFC featherweight champion, and after claiming the title, he didn't relinquish it again for over 5 years, a span during which he took down the Korean Zombie, Frankie Edgar, and Chad Mendes twice. Aldo is arguably the greatest mixed martial artist to fight in his weight class, relying on excellent Muay Thai striking and, frustratingly for his opponents, solid defensive wrestling. At number 7 in our list, we have Stipe Miocic, considered by many in the sport and even a few of his former opponents as the greatest UFC heavyweight of all time. Stipe Miocic is one of the few fighters on our list of the best UFC fighters that's still competing. Miocic has relied on his precise striking and heavy hands to dominate the top division in the UFC, with wins over heavyweight champs Daniel Cormier, Francis Ngannou, and Junior Dos Santos on his resume. At number 6 in our list, we have Amanda Nunes. We could fill up a whole page with the records and achievements Amanda Nunes has racked up over her illustrious MMA career. The Brazilian is without a doubt the greatest female mixed martial artist the sport has ever seen, and has proven it time and time again against the best competition the sport has to offer. She has beaten a whopping 7 current or former UFC champions during her run, including Ronda Rousey and Valentina Shevchenko twice. At number 5 in our list, we have Demetrious Johnson, the greatest flyweight to ever lace him up. Demetrious Johnson was the inaugural champ of the UFC's flyweight division. Thanks to his elite wrestling, lightning speed, and overall elusiveness, Mighty Mouse reigned supreme at 125 pounds for a ridiculous 2,142 days, which included his UFC record, 11 straight successful title defenses. At number 4 in our list, we have Khabib Nurmagomedov. He is the only fighter on this list to have never suffered a defeat. He used a deadly and relentless combination of sambo, wrestling, and judo to aggressively overwhelm his opponents, a technique many have referred to as mauling. He finished his MMA career with dominant finishes of Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje J that left many believing he could be pound for pound the greatest to ever enter the UFC octagon. At number 3 in our list, we have Georges St-Pierre, one of the few fighters on our list who was still at his best when he called it quits. Georges St-Pierre went undefeated from 2007 to 2017 before retiring for good. St-Pierre was a decision expert, winning 12 of his 26 bouts by the scorecards. He is the greatest welterweight fighter in history, but he will be remembered most for coming out of a 4-year retirement to beat and finish Michael Bisping in shocking comeback fashion for the middleweight belt in 2017. At number 2 in our list, we have Anderson Silva, an expert in several disciplines including Muay Thai and Taekwondo. Silva was mainly a stand-up fighter and is widely regarded as the greatest striker in UFC history. Nonetheless, he was still able to secure several notable submission victories over Olympic wrestlers Dan Henderson and Chael Sonnen. The Brazilian is a southpaw but could fight orthodox with great success as well. Our number 1 best UFC fighter of all time, Jon Jones, could easily have an unblemished record if it wasn't for a questionable DQ, which even his opponent disputed. Jones has run through the light heavyweight division, beating opponents by way of everything from guillotine choke to a unanimous decision to TKO via elbows and punches to key lock to a rear naked choke. His 1,463 significant strikes are a UFC light heavyweight record, as is his 95% takedown defense percentage.